Is George Bush right that information extracted from terrorist suspects by waterboarding saved British lives? If so, does the end justify the means?
This is the claim in his book, in George Bush's book, that 3 people were waterboarded, and that in the throes of that, the attacks on Heathrow and on Canary Wharf were averted. Sherrod, you've got some knowledge of countries that torture and people and groups of people who extract information by torture. What's your view about what the President said?
Well, I don't believe it, I'm afraid. I really don't believe it. Torture is always wrong. Waterboarding is torture. And what is more, it doesn't work. People, time after time, the French in Algeria, or our own early use of white noise in Northern Ireland, the way we worked with the Mau Mau in Kenya, torture never works because people will say anything, do anything to stop being tortured. And I just totally condemn any use of torture, and waterboarding among it. And the other point, David, is that you're handing the terrorists a weapon. You're stepping off the moral high ground, you're sinking to their level and giving them a vast propaganda weapon. And George Bush acknowledges in his memoirs that Guantanamo is, frankly, alongside the failure to deal with the problem of Israel and Palestine, the biggest weapon the global jihadists have. It's a big own goal, torture.
So why didn't Obama shut it down?
Because unwinding it is more difficult than setting it up. He's trying to wind it down.
He's trying.
Sorry, let's just stick with George Bush for a minute, then I've got another point. Do you think George Bush believed that the information saved Heathrow and Canary Wharf?
I expect he did. He's an honourable man, as far as I know. I don't think he would lie. Well, I don't.
I agree.
And what do you make of what the head of MI6 said the other day in his speech, that if we hold back and don't pass on intelligence out of concern that a suspect terrorist may be badly treated, innocent lives may be lost that we could have saved?
No,
in other words, that if you are told things, you have to act on it, whatever the source.
Of course you do. If you've got information after the fact that may have come from a foreign intelligence agency that you have doubts about, if you believe that will save not just British lives but anybody's lives, you have to say it, you have to use it.
And that's not condoning torture?
It's not condoning torture because it's after the fact. You get an intelligence report and you have to act on it. But you should utterly condemn torture. It really doesn't work.
Douglas Murray?
Well, of course. I mean, everyone condemns torture, but the problem with the waterboarding issue was that the President was given the advice by his legal advisors that waterboarding did not constitute torture. Now, this country believes that it does.
Do you believe that it does or not?
And I think it's very much borderline. I don't think it's particularly. I don't think it's torture in the sense that most people. I don't think it's torture in the sense that most people describe it as. I mean, you know, look. Put it this way. Put it this way. Everyone agrees that, for instance, pulling out people's fingernails is torture. It's medieval, barbaric torture. Waterboarding has actually been tried by quite a lot of people. Quite often used in anti-interrogation techniques by special forces. A friend of Clive's and mine, Christopher Hitchens, underwent it for Vanity Fair magazine at the request of the editor,
and decided it was torture within 5 minutes.
And he decided it was torture. But I'm just saying that if you know, there was an actor in the BBC series Spooks who got waterboarded as part of his method acting. Now, he didn't get his fingernails pulled out for method acting. The editor of Vanity Fair didn't send one of his columnists to have their fingernails pulled out for method acting.
That's a totally artificial distinction. You're saying it's not torture if they don't physically harm you. I mean, you're suggesting that white noise, because waterboarding doesn't actually remove part of the body or inflict physical injury.
It's obviously in a grey area, and George Bush's legal advisors told him that it was not illegal. Now, the question is whether or not the ends justified means by that. I think they do. I think the figure that the President gave out in his book is that 100 people, there were 100 people captured, 30 of those people were put into a CIA interrogation scheme, and of those, 3 people were waterboarded. Well, we have heard for years from all sorts of lobby groups and all sorts of decent people, but nevertheless, we have been hearing for years that America tortures, George Bush is a war criminal, and so on. It turns out that 3 people were waterboarded by the American officials. I think that if that saved lives, it was worth it. It was a good call.
Okay. Theresa May. I'll come to many people with their hands up. Theresa May, do you want to comment on what Douglas Murray said? Do you believe it's legitimate?
No, I don't believe it's legitimate. I believe, and the government's position is absolutely clear on this, waterboarding is torture, torture is wrong, and we do not condone torture in any way. We condemn the use of torture. And that's the clear position that the government has taken. And we've issued guidance to agents as to how they should operate, which is publicly available for people to see. And we're very absolutely clear about this in terms of torture. And I think it is right that the government does take a very firm position on this and make it clear to people exactly where we stand on this issue. And I disagree with Douglas. I think waterboarding is torture, was not legitimate, and
but
we do not condemn it. But if it had
saved those lives, if it had have done.
Well, you can't know in advance, Douglas. That's the point.
Well, there's a statistic that argues against that, and it's in Bush's book. If you look carefully, he said one of these characters was waterboarded many, many times. Now, if he was waterboarded many, many times, that took a long time.
Sure, but
so it wasn't a matter of a bomb going off tomorrow. It wasn't the ticking bomb scenario at all. It was extended.
But one of the people, at least, who was waterboarded, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, has given, we know, a lot of information.
All right, well, let's check with the Home Secretary. Your Home Secretary, you've been there 6 months. You must have heard about this case. Do you believe information that was accurate was obtained through the waterboarding?
Well, first of all, there is a position we don't talk about intelligence. Secondly, actually, I wasn't Home Secretary at the time that this came through. I've not got any evidence that any information came through as a result of waterboarding in relation to those cases. But as I say, I wasn't there at the time, but I would refer you to Kim Howells, who's a former chairman of the Intelligence Committee, who actually himself said that he and a past minister said that in his view he did not believe that it was the case.
Okay. I'll come to you in a moment, Caroline Flint. The man in the third row there.
I recall from reading the Gulag Archipelago where the very vivid descriptions of psychological torture are outlined in the gulags of the Soviet Union. And I think psychological torture was just as abhorrent then as it is now. And I commend David Cameron and this government for criticising this policy of waterboarding.
And the person up there in the blue shirt, on the left, on the inside there, yes. Yes.
If Douglas Murray believes that waterboarding is a kind of in-between, not sure, grey area of torture or not, then I'd like him to actually, or anybody else in this room, to actually suffer this treatment and then come back.
Nobody is saying it is a nice thing. Nobody is saying it's a nice thing.
Yeah, I mean, the UN, under international law, defines torture as anything that causes physical and mental harm. It's torture. There's no grey area. It's not borderline. It is torture.
There are grey areas. One of the grey areas is whether or not being made to stand up for a long period of time constitutes torture. People being put in so-called stress positions, not being allowed to sit down, being deprived of sleep. There are all sorts of grey areas in this, and different lawyers disagree on different stages in that.
Yes, but
our government takes a different view from the American government.
Clive James. Well, not from the American government now on, because Obama's now banned.
Not now.
Yes, but they're disagreeing over a word. These are some fine semantic distinctions. In fact, one thing unites all the techniques, starting with the bit where you tear pieces off somebody and working up to the point where they maintain their physical integrity, as the Americans say, but they've been subjected to unbearable pain, and that word is unbearable. Torture is when you do something unbearable to someone so that they will speak in order to stop it. And waterboarding is well inside that definition. Incidentally, while I'm disagreeing with you, it's not because I hate to agree with you, but I have to go very close to agreeing with you about the necessity to maintain a sense of proportion about this. Abu Ghraib, for example, which Bush confesses in his book was a crime that happened on his watch. He doesn't say he ordered it, he said it was a crime that happened on his watch, which I think is true. You've got to try and see this in the horrible perspective of the whole conflict. The people who tortured victims in Abu Ghraib were Saddam's. Saddam killed 30,000 people in Abu Ghraib in the course of his career. 30,000 of them, all of them died in agony. Now, the Americans didn't do that. What the Americans did is they humiliated people. It was disgraceful of them to do so, and when it was found out they were doing it, it was a great embarrassment to the Americans.
And they were prosecuted.
But do you think, I mean, I think torture is still going on in Iraq. I don't think the invasion has done anything really to end it. And I imagine if you go to some of the prisons and police stations across what was Mesopotamia, you will still find those techniques being used. So I don't really see...
in some, but not all. I've been to Iraqi prisons where that's certainly not the case. It's very much reformed since Saddam's days.
Well,
I think
is torture used in Saudi Arabia?
I have no evidence that it's used, but I would not be surprised if it were.
They merely behead people in public squares.
No, hang on a second. I was just thinking that the evidence that came across for the bombs on the Boeing, whatever the planes were that were carrying cargo, that came from Saudi Arabia. Do you think that was A, acquired by torture, and B, if you were told
I've
that there's
no
a bomb
idea.
on the plane...
I haven't seen the intelligence. I wasn't in government, but
you've been
I
in
would
Saudi
say
Arabia,
that the
so you know about that.
I would say that the Saudi state was threatened by a very serious Al-Qaeda campaign that wounded a BBC journalist, Frank Gardner, killed a BBC cameraman, Simon Cumbers. There was a memorial service for him today in St Bride's in Fleet Street. And the Saudis have run a very successful program for de-radicalizing terrorists by tough security measures, reaching out to them, and their experts have been over to lecture our own MI5.
At the same time as putting this hatred around the world and exporting terrorists.
That's absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish.
In the light of the reports of mutiny against Labour leadership, are the Labour MPs right to be supporting Phil Willis?
Douglas Murray.
Well, I mean, it's not unheard of for politicians, particularly party political hacks, who've worked their way up from the NUS, like Phil Willis did, to behave with extraordinary cynical opportunism on the election trail. It's always surprising that more MPs don't get caught for this. But I have to say there was something particularly egregious about some of the literature which Phil Willis put out. The group Al-Mujahirun, who were protesting in one of their guises by the 2-minute silence in London earlier today and burning poppies, were put by Phil Willis's campaign, it seems, on the front of one of these pieces of literature, holding things saying, behead those who insult Islam and so on. This is, I have to say, a great example of what Phil Willis did during his period as immigration minister as well, which is he talked a different game from the one he did. As immigration minister, he talked incredibly tough. He used to give tub-thumping interviews. He did a famous one to the Times, and did nothing like it, thus, again, extending the already vast gap between political rhetoric and reality. And in this case, he had the cynicism to put a group on the front of his leaflet saying these things, which he and the government that he was a part of had allowed to thrive all these years.
That's not the point, is it? The point is whether he told lies about the Liberal Democrats and his opponents.
Well, it seems he did. This is the
Liberal Democrat pact with the devil, he says here. Yes.
I don't think that's literally true. But I think we'll see.
Thank you. Just like to disagree quite strongly with the person who spoke from the floor a moment ago. There is a very important point about the relationship between economic interests and the lack of interest in human rights. It's been so Show picked it up earlier in the evening in an oblique reference to the Middle East and Palestine, Israel, and I speak as a Jew on this issue, that where we've been ignoring human rights throughout the Middle East, then what happens is you get the production of the extremist behaviour, and then you start to try and deal with that with things like waterboarding, and you end up into a vicious spiral.
Okay.
We have to solve the question in the Middle East.
No, all right, well, let's go back to China. Briefly, if you would.
The question was on profits before human rights. I mean, look, it's not easy being a country that used to be the top dog, going around as, I think Sir Sherrod said, the sort of major sort of second league player. And it doesn't mean you can pull your weight. It doesn't mean you can lecture people like perhaps you can when you're the top dog. Did he put profits over human rights? Well, he had to do a bit of both. Yes, he has to, in the current situation, go around the world, as the government have been recently, selling Britain Inc. You know, this company about this island off the shores of Europe that's trying to crawl its way back in the world. Now, that's going to lead to some pretty unpleasant sights. But it is disturbing, I have to say, not to mention more publicly in a country with, I think, 1 million people in forced labour camps, hundreds of political prisoners, not to highlight that more. But that's the situation Britain is now in. And I just wanted to say one other thing quickly, which is we were talking earlier tonight about 3 terrorists who were waterboarded by America. We see, coming up here, China emerging as, in our lifetimes, the top player in the world. And those who think they don't like American supremacy in world affairs should just wait and see what you get when you have Chinese supremacy, because that's going to be a very different thing indeed.
Okay.